Thank you very much, Angela, and it's good to have all of you here today. I just wanted to start off by saying that actually one of the best parts of my job as a librarian is getting to meet wonderful people like Mira and Anjuli to learn about their research projects and get to help with their systematic reviews. And so today, the three of us wanted to do some demystifying of the elements of a systematic review, talk about best practices, and use case studies from Anjuli and Mira's experiences to illustrate how these projects go in real life. So, systematic reviews are important contributions to the field because they synthesize and evaluate what is known about the effectiveness of interventions or associations between certain qualities or circumstances and health outcomes. Systematic review methodology started in the health sciences and is now branching out beyond the health sciences. But today, all of our examples will be focused on their use in healthcare fields and HIV research in particular. I am based in the Suzzallo Library now after 7 years at the UW Health Sciences Library. And over the years, my colleagues and I have occasionally encountered misconceptions like these. Sometimes it turns out that the person is interested in conducting a systematic search or a thorough search instead of conducting a systematic review according to accepted practices. Other times, a person may not yet have enough information to know if a systematic review is the right fit. But I think the most common misconception is that a systematic review is the only good kind of review to do. And as we'll see in a moment, there are many types of reviews, and ultimately the type of review you choose to conduct will depend on the topic you're researching, the available evidence, and your goals. So since the goal of a systematic review is to evaluate the evidence, systematic review methodology incorporates many different best practices that offer transparency and reduce bias. So for example, the research question, the approach, inclusion and exclusion criteria are all established before the systematic search is conducted. More than one person reviews the evidence. The studies that meet the agreed upon inclusion criteria undergo critical appraisal, and the data from those diverse primary studies is extracted and presented to the reader in a structured way. Another important aspect of a systematic review is that it addresses a specific research question, and it might or might not include meta-analysis. But here are two examples of published systematic reviews involving UW researchers. The first one investigated the effect of HIV testing services on sexual behavior, and they looked at multiple aspects of sexual behavior. The second one examined the efficacy of peer interventions for HIV. And as you can see in each review, their conclusions were the answer to the question based on their analysis of the evidence. Another type of review you might be familiar with is the scoping review. And scoping review methodology is similar to systematic review methodology, but one important difference is the purpose of the review. So with scoping reviews, the purpose is typically to describe the nature and extent of the evidence. So in the first UW article shown here, you'll see that they reviewed what's been written about creating and implementing community advisory boards in low and middle income countries. But they're not asking and answering a specific question. Instead, their conclusions are the identification of frequently reported challenges and then implications for research ethics. And in the second article there, the results of the review were the identification of 3 consent-related strategies for expanding adolescent participation in HIV research. So in these cases, the researchers would have decided that based on the existing literature, this was the appropriate kind of review to conduct, one that described the nature and extent of the literature on this topic. So when I do get questions about what type of review to choose, typically people are asking about systematic reviews versus scoping reviews, so the ones we just talked about. But there are more than 2 possibilities. According to this article, there are at least 14 review types, and here they outline the differences among the different types of reviews and points to consider, like the type of evidence and the amount of time you have. But again, they're not making a judgment as to one review type being better than another. But the idea is once you identify what kind of review you're doing, then you'll want to stick with the methodology that's appropriate for that review type. So today we're going to stick to systematic reviews, but at the end of the presentation, I've got some references that talk about how to conduct a scoping review. As far as guidance for conducting systematic reviews goes, these are 3 highly regarded resources from the Cochrane collaboration, the Joanna Briggs Institute, and the National Academies. These are the ones that we see most often pointed to as guidance that's used for people conducting the reviews. The Cochrane and JBI guides are really guidance for conducting the reviews that they publish, but they're commonly used to, for people conducting systematic reviews that will be published elsewhere. You might find one institute's guidance more relevant than another. So JBI, for example, has guidance for different kinds of systematic reviews and scoping reviews. And so JBI has guidance for systematic reviews of qualitative evidence and systematic reviews of incidence and prevalence. The National Academy's guidance focuses on systematic reviews of comparative effectiveness research. And this is an example of the sorts of standards that are published. This one's from the National Academies. And in this standard, they outline the expertise and experience that should be held by a systematic review team, not necessarily individual people, but having this expertise and experience. So at a minimum, they recommend expertise in the pertinent clinical areas, expertise in systematic review methods, expertise in searching, and expertise in quantitative methods. So that just gives you an idea of what these handbooks and guidances are like. So speaking of teams, one thing that Dr. Susan Graham asked us to cover today was the magnitude of work involved in a systematic review, people and time. I found one study that looked at 195 published systematic reviews, and they were selected because they had protocols registered in Prospero, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the authors used the date that the protocol was registered and the date of publication of the article to calculate the amount of time involved in conducting systematic reviews of healthcare interventions. So the authors did acknowledge that a significant amount of work can happen before the protocol gets registered. So it could be assembling your team, determining inclusion and exclusion criteria, conducting preliminary searches, maybe performing inter-rater reliability for the literature screening, or maybe obtaining funding. So, but given that caveat, the mean estimated time between the protocol registration date and the date of publication was 67.3 weeks, so longer than an academic quarter. Looking at the same set of reviews, the authors also determined that the mean number of authors on the published reviews was 5. So we're going to shift. So the table, the top 2 items are from this article. The bottom 2, we're going to put a little less emphasis on methodology used to obtain these numbers. But I wanted to try to address a question that I get more often, which is how many references would be a good number to screen. So typically I say some variation of it depends, but I went through a small set of published systematic reviews that I had helped with at some point in order to get some examples. So for my very non-random sample of 18 UW articles, the mean number of references that was screened was 2,687, and the mean number of studies included in the final review was 32. So with that introduction, we're going to spend the rest of the presentation going through the steps involved in conducting a systematic review and the experiences of Anjuli and Mira. So for the first step of planning the project and forming the team, I am going to turn the mic over to Mira Reichman.
Thank you. So my name is Mira. Like Angela mentioned, I'm a first-year clinical psychology PhD student, and I'm going to talk about a review that I'm currently working on. We're actually in the very beginning stages, so a good illustration of how a lot of work goes into the project even before you register a protocol. But we'll talk about a couple aspects of the project and steps in the process to illustrate some of the points that Diana is making. Could you advance that? Perfect. So basically this review, the topic is integrated mental health services within HIV treatment and prevention services. And so this is a project, there is multiple motivations to start this. It's associated with the BIRCH Center. And so interested in contributing to that work in terms of elucidating what is known related to integrated mental health care for HIV and where gaps in literature might be. I also have a passion for qualitative research and a background doing a lot of qualitative research, so I was interested in kind of bringing those experiences to the work of my current mentor at UW, Jane Simoni. And finally, this was a new area of research for me, so I felt like doing a literature review of some sort would be a great way for me as an individual to get a sense of what is this field and what I might be interested in and able to contribute to within the field. And of course, I felt like I had the time to kind of undertake a large project. So basically the topic, as I mentioned, is we're looking at studies that have investigated approaches to integrating mental health services within HIV treatment and prevention services. And we specifically decided to focus on qualitative studies because this question is kind of inherently related to implementation and looking at basically the question of like, how can we best integrate mental health services within HIV services? And so a question like that, that's looking at how and kind of strategies and barriers and facilitators is a good question to look at qualitative data for. And that also felt like a natural way to narrow the scope of the review a little bit. So this is our question. It's what determinants of implementation impact success of integrating mental health services into HIV treatment and prevention services. And we're only looking at qualitative studies. So far, we talked a lot about whether to restrict based on geographical location. So knowing that there's likely a lot of differences in strategies that are successful in depending on like resources of a setting and location and cultural factors and many other factors. But what we've decided so far is to be extremely broad in our search and look for everything that comes up, because we're really not sure how much we'll find. And then we'll be able to make decisions as we go about whether we kind of separate out analyses to look at studies by geographical location or synthesize across locations. But those are some of the things we've thought about in determining our scope. And then our team, so I'm leading the team as a student, and then we have 7 undergraduate research assistants. So this was something where I kind of pretty quickly realized that I would want support on the team and that it is an intensive project that requires a lot of hours of work. And so I wanted to recruit a team, and it also felt like a fun opportunity as a student to have an opportunity to be a leader a little bit and have some mentorship opportunities and provide an opportunity for undergrads to learn a lot about research methodology and literature review methodology and a new topic that they could be interested in. So yeah, our current stage is we actually just yesterday kicked off our eligibility screening. So we've been working for the last couple of months with Diana on formalizing our scope, our inclusion and exclusion criteria, our search strategy, running our search, and getting all set up in our software, which we'll talk about later, that we're going to be using to organize our search and screening. So that's our current stage. So you'll hear me give examples mainly related to the initial phases of conducting a systematic review, because that's what we've done so far. You can advance the slide, please, Diana. Thank you. Perfect. So our first step was determining our needs as a team and recruiting people to fill those needs. So when it comes to the process of screening articles for inclusion, that is a very time-intensive process. And it's definitely kind of, Diana was talking earlier about expertise. It's definitely facilitated by team members having knowledge of the subject area and familiarity with the topics they're reading about, but it is definitely a task that I personally believe like someone of any training level can be successfully supported in doing. So it felt like a very appropriate task to include undergraduate research assistants in without necessarily a lot of previous research experience. So we decided to recruit a team of 7 undergrads to help with screening, which I wasn't sure exactly what the right number would be. Part of me wanted to kind of, there was a lot of interest when I put out an ad. I feel like we could have recruited a team of like 20 or 30 based on the people that reached out, which is a good note for anyone who is looking to recruit undergraduate RAs. There's a lot of demand for research opportunities, but I kind of determined the team size based on what I felt like I would be able to manage effectively and provide supervision for, and wanting there to be a sense of team cohesion and kind of commitment to the project. So those were the things I was thinking about. And we've basically devoted the last month to training the team. And so I felt like the team would be more effective in screening articles if they had some familiarity with both the topic of our systematic review, so integrated mental health care for HIV, and also the methodology associated with conducting a systematic review. So as I've worked with Diana on formalizing our search strategy and protocol, I've had the research assistants read articles related to the topic area and resources related to conducting a systematic review, and kind of do little exercises related to practicing the different steps involved in a review, so that now that we're starting screening, I'm hoping that they have more of a foundation to be able to screen effectively and also understand more of what they're reading and be more engaged in the process as well. I guess just a brief note about supervision. In my previous experience conducting a systematic review, I found it really helpful to have like regular check-ins, and I think like face-to-face check-ins are really helpful. So we have a weekly meeting that's 45 minutes, and I'm thinking at some point we'll cut it down to 30 or less, but it's been really helpful to have a weekly time to check in and kind of, since it is such a long project, to keep the momentum moving and kind of have a motivation each week to make progress and assign tasks and divide up responsibilities. And also, since it's such an important learning opportunity for the team, to provide an opportunity for people to ask questions and discuss and, be as collaborative and creative as possible. So that's kind of everything related to forming a team that I have. And then later we'll use my project a bit as an example for a search strategy and using software to organize screening.
Great, now I'll tell you about a second case study. Thanks, Diana. I'm Anjuli Wagner. I'm in the Department of Global Health and started this project embarrassingly 3 years ago. So that gives you an idea of where I am in the bell curve of that distribution of how long it takes to do a review. So the case study that I'll be telling you about is
I'm listening.
a World Health Organization sponsored review of what works for generating demand for HIV testing. And this was the purpose of doing this review. It actually came from the World Health Organization. They do systematic reviews to inform their guideline development process. And so they commission reviews. And there were a series of reviews being done at the University of Washington. I led this along with my colleague, Irene Jaguna, and it informed the 2019 WHO guidelines. The work that we're doing now is updating the review because we did not publish it in time. And now there's a ton of work that has happened since 2019. But I just wanted to show you what the impact of a review can look like in the real world. So you see on the right-hand side of this slide, this is the app that WHO puts out for their HIV testing services or HTS guidelines. And you can see there the various different reviews that were done for this round of guidelines and a screenshot of what the good practice statement about demand generation looks like as a result of our review. So this was a systematic review that followed the PICO format. It was a quantitative review that was followed by grade methodology, and that's a requirement from WHO. I'll mention it a bit later. And our question was, what works to generate demand for HIV testing? We had a very, very large review, an atypically large review. We screened about 29,000 abstracts in the first round that resulted in about 100 randomized trials included in the first round. And in the second round that we've done, it's up to about 140 total trials. And there were some kind of unique challenges with this particular case study. There was a very aggressive timeline and low budget. There was a large team because we relied on a lot of volunteers, and which required us to innovate in ways around quality assurance and quality checking. And the scope was initially pretty unclear from WHO and quite subject to creep. So when you're working with an external funder and you're not necessarily driving the whole scientific agenda, think about where scope exists. But the impact was this good practice statement. Next slide. Thanks, Diana. So I wanted to go back to one of the notes that Diana made about who to have on your team with the National Academy's guidance of who contributed expertise. So in this review, we had clinical content area about HIV testing. We were so grateful for Diana's help and a WHO methodologist for the systematic review methods and searching for relevant evidence. Then for the quantitative methodology, because we also did meta-analysis within this publication, Irene and myself, as well as the methodologist at WHO, contributed that expertise. And the last group, which is kind of interesting, is because WHO commissions these reviews, they actually had a guideline development group. And the guideline development group was who declared the priority outcomes for this review and suggested relevant subgroup analyses. So it was very interesting to see how the interplay was between a commissioning group and the scientists executing the search. This was, as I mentioned, large and person power. We had 14 different reviewers total. Kudos and call out to everyone on the bottom who contributed their time and expertise. And they were involved at different stages of the review. No one has been there for the whole review because, as I mentioned, it's taken a long time. And I wanted to give you a flavor of how long it took to do different stages. When we were up and running after doing training, people were getting to about 1 minute per title and abstract review, and then 1 hour for extracting data from a quantitative study and doing quality assessment. So if you're trying to get a ballpark range of how long is it going to take to get through 29,000 abstracts and stuff, this can be a ballpark. And then one note about timeline, we did our initial review between January and August of 2019. We attempted to update it without dedicated support. in 2019 and 2020, which did not go well. And then we got dedicated financial support for a update, which is going to be finished in the next 3 weeks. And I'll hand it back over now to Diana about scope.
Great, so thank you very much. So for the next step of determining the scope of the systematic review, we've already heard some of the challenges described by Mira and Anjuli. So for here, I'll just mention that the process of going through that scope refinement and deciding how to approach the search and developing the protocol often evolve together. So some steps that can be helpful at that earlier stage, if you don't have, I suppose, like in the WHO example, that's a different sort of example, but if you're embarking on it according to what your team exclusively wants to do, some things that can be helpful are to look for similar systematic reviews on related topics, so you can see what aspects did they cover, maybe what would be a good niche for you. You can learn from their searches. That's something that I am always happy to do. You can see if someone has registered a protocol for something that's similar to yours, both to get an idea of what's being done and then also not to unnecessarily duplicate work. It helps a lot to do preliminary searches to get a sense of evidence that's available and to inform what approach you're going to take. And that can also help you in that reviewing some of the initial sets of references. You can get a better idea of what criteria you're going to use for inclusion and exclusion. And then as you work through all those details, you can develop a protocol. It's increasingly common for teams to register their systematic review protocols. The most well-known place to register a protocol is Prospero. Their goal is to provide a comprehensive listing of systematic review projects with health-related outcomes. One benefit of protocol registration, like I mentioned, is that it helps avoid unplanned duplication of effort. Another benefit is minimizing risk of bias in a similar way that when you register a clinical trial, like at clinicaltrials.gov, that helps minimize risk of bias, because basically in the protocol, you said what your plan was, and then the results of your review or your trial confirm that you stuck to your plan. If you are not conducting a systematic review with health-related outcomes, which is a requirement of Prospero, another place you could consider posting your protocol is Open Science Framework. That is an open source site for research collaboration, documentation, archiving documents, and it lets you decide what aspects of your work you would like to share and what aspects you would like to keep just within your team. So that alternative, you could write your protocol according to Prisma P guidelines, then just save it as a PDF, upload it for free to OSF, and then it generates a URL which you can then cite in your article. So an example of a protocol that's in Prospero, this is just the first part, but you can see the level of detail that they want you to include. So the difference at Prospero is that typically they would do a brief review to see that you have filled out the form the way they want it to be filled out. So there's a person who is in between you writing it and it being made publicly available. So you likely would have developed a preliminary search strategy for maybe one database as part of writing your protocol. But now we're going to talk a little bit about conducting the systematic searches, where you're conducting thorough searches and you're using the same criteria in multiple databases to gather the relevant evidence from each source. And many people find it helpful to use a framework when they're trying to structure their research question in the form that works well for a search, for a literature search. So breaking down the question into its essential components. Anjuli mentioned PICO, and that's probably the one that is most familiar, where you break down your question into the population, the intervention, comparison if there is one, outcomes. Sometimes it includes study design, like randomized control trials or setting. There are lots of variations, but that's the idea, breaking it down into essential elements. When I was looking for examples of other protocols, this one I wanted to include just in part because it is very fun to say, CocoaPop, and that is used for searches relating to incidence and prevalence, where you break down your research question into condition, context, and population. So once you've identified those essential components, you can then generate terms that express or represent those concepts, and then write search strategies to extract all the references that meet your search criteria. So searching is typically an iterative process. So you test a combination of terms to find a good balance between recall, your thoroughness, and your precision, retrieving things that are more likely to be relevant. So you can also use known articles to test your strategy and make sure that your strategy picks up the evidence you already know about, and it's a good way to help you ensure that the data you're collecting is the data you want to address the question you're trying to answer. So there's a lot of testing that goes on to make sure that a search strategy works the way we think it should in a database. So for example, I looked at a published systematic review on point of care HIV-1 RNA testing. And as just part of their PubMed strategy, they included this exact phrase. So point of care HIV-1 viral load, which means look for that exact string of characters exactly as written. So this was only part of the strategy. But when I look at a quoted phrase like that, my brain starts spinning and I start scanning abstracts and thinking about all of the variations of this phrase that might turn up in a title or an abstract, and then figure out how we can make the strategy capture those variations. And if they don't get captured, like these examples here, then I figure out how to capture the variations. And then that's the next iteration of the search. So I get very enthusiastic about this part. This is the puzzle part for me, and the is this fun part. So if you do decide to embark on a systematic review or another type of evidence synthesis, these are the sorts of things that a librarian could advise on. Recommending databases and sources of gray literature. So that could be like dissertations or white papers. Working through the process with you of developing a search strategy that will let you collect the evidence that you need, and then helping you navigate database features and quirks, so that when you do conduct the searches, they're comparable searches in multiple databases. So next, Mira and Anjuli are going to talk about how this aspect of the review went for them.
Yeah, so this is a slide that summarizes our search strategy for the review that I'm working on, which I absolutely could not have developed without Diana's help. So at the top, you can see the general concepts that we brainstormed together to include in the search strategy. So in line with the topic that I described earlier, one of our key concepts is the concept of integrated care. Then there's HIV, mental health, and then qualitative. So you can kind of see how those concepts together would capture the articles that are of relevance to our question. And this was something that we developed kind of talking together, Diana and I, which was really helpful. So we kind of talked through like what I was thinking for the review, what my question was, what types of studies I was looking to capture. And then Diana had the expertise to be able to kind of clearly delineate what the key search concepts would be. And then you can see in this table in the bottom left, this is just an excerpt of the search terms that we used within each of these concepts. And this was, again, a step that I would not have had the expertise to be able to fully flesh out all the possible terms that could be used to capture each of these concepts. So it was extremely helpful to have Diana's expertise. And Diana also did a lot of looking into other similar reviews and what they had used to search for these different concepts and pulling terms from other reviews. And as one example, you can kind of tell that out of these concepts, the most tricky to search for is the concept of integrated care. That's like a very complex concept and a relatively new concept, and people use different terms for programs that would kind of fit into that category. And so one key helpful breakthrough that Diana made was discovering that previous librarians and researchers have developed an evidence-based search strategy for this very concept. So we were able to pull a lot of our search terms for the integrated care concept from this published search strategy, which is really helpful for when we're publishing our article to be able to say directly where we got our search strategy from. And then just mentioning briefly, Diana was kind of talking about the process of like testing your search strategy and the iterative nature of it. And something that we did together was I did some like preliminary searches and would find articles that felt relevant to my review that I would want the search strategy to capture. And then as Diana kind of iterated the search strategy, we would check whether those articles that I had found were showing up with the search we were using. So that was a good check of kind of feeling confident that the search strategy was capturing what we wanted it to.
Great. And I'll talk briefly about the search strategy for our review. And I echo Mira's point about how absolutely crucial Diana was in this process. Thank you so much. I will never grow tired of thanking you for all the many, many hours that you put into developing and translating this search across platforms and training it and such. So within our case study, we found from some early work reading around that there's probably enough evidence to restrict to only RCTs. That was helpful to know. We struggled to figure out what is demand creation, and I wish that we had had a published search strategy that we could have used. That was probably the hardest one, and there wasn't really a lot of consensus on what demand creation was. I'll briefly mention here, our search strategy had 3 components. The first one was HIV testing. The last one was a Cochrane like RCT string. There are 2 strings there that you could use. One's a little more sensitive and the other one's a little more specific. And we chose to go with the more specific one. And in the middle, we had a demand creation component that had 4 possible categories separated by or statements. And it's very long and didn't fit on a slide. And I just want to note that the refinement process with that search strategy based on the team's knowledge of papers was really essential and substantially changed our search strategy. I also wanted to put in a plug for memoing along the way. Just like you use memos or SOPs or any other type of documentation within your research practice that's not systematic reviews, I highly encourage the use of memoing to document the search refinement process and the actual pull process. Because doing the search, executing the search, downloading everything and importing it into wherever you're going to manage it is very complex. And we've had to do this, we've had to do three separate pulls. And having this initial memo that my colleague Irene wrote was life-saving. And you can see just how much detail there is about what database was searched at what time, what particularities there were about the database, like if you can only pull 1,000 at a time, things like that. So I recommend making extensive use of memos throughout this process. And thank Diana again. Back to you, Diana. Oh, I apologize. Sorry, the next one is me, and we're talking about screening and selecting studies. My apologies. Thanks. So if you can go to the next slide. When we moved after the search, we moved into the screening and selection of studies for this review. And I'll mention what our team did in this situation and talk later about the analysis process. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to train a team to review consistently. And there were many team members separated by geography with varying different levels of expertise and things coming in at different times of the review. So we chose to systematize the onboarding process. We asked everybody to do some pre-reading, similar to what Mira mentioned of reading certain papers. We used some papers for training. And then for example, title and abstract review, I would sit with each new person. We would explain the process and talk together, like explaining how to screen for 2 or 3. Then I would demonstrate 2 or 3 with them just watching and highlighting, here's a keyword that lets you know that this is not relevant. And then I'd observe them doing 2 or 3. Then we'd do small batches with consensus, and it would be like, let's have these 2 newly onboarded reviewers review 5 abstracts, and we come together the next week to discuss and get consensus together. And within some of the tracking programs, you can use flags or other types of notes to flag tricky items that you want to review during your weekly meetings. I highly recommend that because no one can remember all of the details of the ones that tripped you up. I also wanted to mention that there is very well written guidance on how to do systematic reviews, and there are still ways of interpreting it differently. So during your calls, your team calls, and I have team calls twice a week for 30 minutes now, we discuss and document things when we have some vague guidance. So for example, how to judge blinding within a study. And we'll discuss it during our call. We'll document our provisional approach. We'll try that approach for a small number of reviews and then report back. And then we document our decision in memos again. And later you'll hear about tracking systems that are fully integrated like Covidence. But I also wanted to make a plug for like a Google tracking sheet as a complementary tracker, particularly with these calibration and tracking issues. And now I will pass it back to Diana. Thanks.
So as Anjuli mentioned, different tools can be useful for different aspects of a systematic review. I was making notes about the memos there. And some of the decisions are just going to depend on what the team is familiar with or what they have access to. Many people make use of Excel or Google Sheets or a citation manager. And then sometimes teams will choose software that's specifically designed for managing the systematic review process. Some benefits of these, many of these specialized software tools are that they can remove duplicate references for you, usually offer a mechanism for screening citations and resolving any conflicts between screeners. They might have customizable forms for extracting data. And then some of them are starting to incorporate artificial intelligence assistance for screening. So I don't have experience with some of these that I have listed down here, but at the end of the presentation, there are a few references on comparing the different systematic review software packages. And I'll just mention that some are free and some are not free. So one of the not free tools that we wanted to highlight that both Anjuli and Mira are using is Covidence. And many people at UW have used that. We don't have an institutional license, but I have been told that the current fee for using Covidence for a single review is about $230. So that you can get a feel for how this works, Mira is going to demonstrate some of the features of Covidence.
Yes. So this is the Covidence. We just thought it would be helpful to give people a visual of what it looks like and what some of the features are, just so you can kind of envision how it could be helpful for your team. So you can see here that my team is at the very beginning stages of our screening. So we have 89 articles that have been screened by one reviewer on our team. But this is what the Covidence interface looks like. You import your references after conducting the searches like we've described. So we searched in 5 different databases, and after each one downloaded the results and then upload into Covidence. And that process was very smooth and pretty straightforward, I would say, although I love the recommendation that Anjuli made to keep track of the specifics of that. And Diana helped me with that by kind of writing out the steps for me. And then as you import into Covidence, it automatically removes duplicates for you, which was really helpful. So you can kind of see here that we ended up with almost exactly 5,000 references to screen. And that was after removing almost 3,000 duplicates that came up in our searches of the 5 databases. So with the Covidence subscription, you can have unlimited members on your team. So here you can see I've like added reviewers to my team, and you can manage the abilities of different users on your team. So you can set it that studies are screened by certain people and conflicts resolved by other people, or you can set it so that reviewers can do any of the roles depending on what your protocol is. And then you can keep track of individual contributions here. So you can see that 2 of my team members have started screening. We just started yesterday, but starting to make progress. And then I was going to show what the interface looks like when you are going into screen. So this is how it looks. You can choose to either show titles and abstracts together or to hide abstracts and then kind of like look at them one by one as you would like to. And you also can have if you input your inclusion and exclusion criteria into the site, then you can have that show at the top. And so basically for each article, your team members are deciding yes, no, or maybe. The maybe feature is interesting. It seems to function basically as a yes in terms of what the decision rules are, but it's just a way for your team members to denote maybe more hesitancy and more need to discuss. And then we haven't had any articles proceed to this phase, but you can see that Covidence keeps track for you of the articles that require conflict resolution among reviewers, so that if you have a team leader or a system for doing that, they can go in and specifically look at the articles that have conflict related to screening. And then you also can do your full text review and extraction, which we haven't done yet, but a lot of features in Covidence, and it so far has seemed really user-friendly and easy to use, and they have a lot of really helpful help videos as well in terms of articles and videos that demonstrate all the different features. You also can generate your Prisma diagram from here, which I think is cool. All right, I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Mira. I echo your comment about Covidence being really useful and user-friendly. I'll tell you a bit about the different tools and how they integrate together to do risk of bias assessment, data extraction, and then synthesis of results. Some of these will be relevant for your review, some of them won't. It just depends on what is necessary in your review. One plug I wanted to make for Covidence that I just remembered is there's a mobile version of it. So you can be screening on your phone on the bus, which a lot of my team members did. And it's, you know, an alternative to Instagram. Next slide, please. So I'll show you tools that we used for extraction, exportation, and post-processing. Oh my. Covidence is very useful for extracting quantitative data. I'm curious to hear about Mira's experience with the qualitative data. You also are guided through the process of assessing risk of bias. I'll talk more about that in a moment. In our review, we then moved from Covidence into RevMan, which is a tool made by the Cochrane Review Group. And you can use RevMan, or you could use Stata or R or any other statistical programming language. And that's useful for summarizing quantitative data and summarizing the risk of bias. RevMan, I'll show you in a moment, is very useful for the risk of bias summary. And then finally, for the WHO review, we had to use the grade methodology. And so we used a program called GradePro, and that synthesizes quantitative data and risk of bias assessments and assessments of the strength of the evidence. Next slide. So within Covidence, as you saw, there are so many wonderful pieces of functionality. If you're doing a quantitative review and you're ready to jump into extraction, I highly recommend, because I made errors along the way, to imagine the dummy tables of the manuscript or your report first, then make your extraction tools and only extract those things that are relevant in your final tables. It's going to save you so much time and have it be really streamlined. I also recommend pilot testing the extraction process and refining it, and pilot testing the exportation of your results into the next program you're going to use, and make sure that it does the export and import correctly before you've extracted for 100 RCTs incorrectly. Within the Covidence, you can do risk of bias assessment. There are many tools that can be used for risk of bias assessment, like the Cochrane Risk of Bias 1 or ROB2, Robbins, Newcastle, Ottawa, many different approaches. You're going to want to pick the one that matches well with the evidence type in your review. And it's especially critical to train folks on the risk of bias assessment in this component. And, you know, Mira made a great point earlier that many of the steps in a systematic review can be done by someone who doesn't have extremely deep methodologic knowledge or content knowledge in an area. This is one area where I think it really pays to have someone who has strong methodologic expertise, even if they don't know the content area very well. Next slide, please. So here are some graphics of what the outputs from a meta-analysis might look like, and reports if you're doing that as part of your systematic review. And as Diana mentioned, not all systematic reviews include meta-analysis. So this traffic light looking thing that came out of RevMan, this summarizes the risk of bias assessment from one of our reviews, and it gets populated automatically, which is a really nice feature. We used Stata to create our forest plots and pool our similar studies into a single estimate. Again, you could use RevMan or R or any other statistical language. Next slide, please. And then finally, GradePro. This is a visual of some of the output from GradePro, and it combines together all of the information that you have on a particular question, and there are typically many footnotes that are in there. If you have specific questions about GradePro, please ask me. I'd be happy to mention them, but it's a pretty niche area that you might only use in certain reviews. And I'll pass back over to Diana at this point. Thanks.
So I was going to talk very briefly about the key differences and a little bit of what data extraction could look like for a qualitative review. And as I mentioned, the review I'm working on currently has not reached this stage yet, but I was going to pull from previous experiences I've had just to highlight some of the things to be thinking about from the beginning. So there are different, as you could imagine, when you're reviewing qualitative evidence, you're not pulling out, you know, specific numbers, you're pulling out much more loose, intangible qualitative findings. And it can be tricky because studies report qualitative findings in very different ways. There's a lot of approaches to qualitative data analysis, and findings reporting looks very different across studies. So it can be tricky, but it can also be very meaningful to synthesize qualitative evidence across studies. So there's different common approaches. I put up 2 examples, metasynthesis, meta-ethnography, that have their own kind of intention and guidelines for conduct. The one that I have done before is metasynthesis, which is basically the idea is looking at the themes or qualitative findings across a range of studies and trying to derive higher level themes that summarize the qualitative evidence as a whole, and also beyond just summarizing the qualitative evidence, offer novel interpretations of the evidence that you can only do by kind of looking across studies at themes that were found. So I really liked the point that Anjuli made about imagining your dummy tables first, or like imagining what you want your findings to look like as you're designing your data extraction process. And I think that applies really well to qualitative findings as well, potentially even more so because there are so many ways that you could present qualitative findings, and it's helpful to be specific about what types of findings you're looking to extract from studies, because it may be that some of the studies that are relevant to your review have a broader question or have a different question than your research question for your review. So your job when you're extracting data is to find the findings that are relevant to your question and pull those specific findings from studies. So this is an example on the right of a review that I've worked on in the past that was a qualitative review of stress and coping in persons diagnosed with young onset dementia and their caregivers. So some things that this review illustrated is it can be really helpful to have a theoretical framework to organize data extraction for qualitative research, if there is one that makes sense for your research question. So as an example, in this review, we were using a stress and coping framework to structure data extraction. And that was really helpful because when our reviewers went in to read articles, you're kind of tuned in to be looking for a specific type of finding. So in our case, we were looking for stressors and coping strategies as relevant for both persons with the diagnosis and caregivers. And it's just helpful to have kind of like that specificity of lens when you're reading an article, because as I mentioned, qualitative data can be just more difficult and vague and ill-defined. And so it's helpful to be as specific as you can about your question and what types of findings you're looking to extract. And so you can kind of see how our findings resulted in a final table where we have sub-themes. So those were kind of like broader, higher level metasynthesis themes. And then we have specific findings, and then we kept track of which articles reported a given finding. So we have supportive literature. And I believe we did that as like illustrative, not necessarily comprehensive. So we put a sampling of articles that reported a particular finding. Basically, so the steps kind of probably are somewhat parallel to with a quantitative review. We always have 2 reviewers extract data, and then we do conflict resolution among those 2 reviewers and then synthesis across studies. And because this was so time intensive, it was helpful to have structured time for the 2 reviewers to meet and resolve conflicts between the 2 of them before we even brought it to the bigger team or to the team leaders, because there was a lot of conflict just because it's so subjective extracting qualitative findings. And so what we did is we kind of we had our reviewers paired, and I think we kind of shifted the pairings around over the articles. And then we would have reviewers in groups of 2 meet together and go over articles individually and try and find as much consensus as they can among the articles that they extracted. And then we would, as a team, discuss discrepancies that were remaining and work on deriving our higher level themes. So this is just a very brief overview, and I'm definitely not an expert in this methodology, but I thought it'd be helpful just to show a bit about what that can look like for qualitative reviews, because it's quite different than meta-analyses or quantitative reviews.
Excellent. I was getting sucked in. I forgot it was my turn again. That was very interesting. The last step we're going to cover is reporting the results. Here our advice is pretty straightforward. You just follow Prisma, and you use their checklist and their flow diagram when you write your review. The main thing to let you know is that the original Prisma checklist and flow diagrams were published in 2009, and there are now new editions. It says 2020, but they weren't published until 2021, so they're very new, they're similar. They're similar, but those are the current ones. They're the 2020 ones. And the main thing they do is they let the reader assess the risk of bias in the review. They let the reader determine how applicable the research findings might be to their situations, and they provide the details to let someone else replicate the review. So this is the PRISMA 2020 checklist. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. You often submit that with your manuscript to a journal publisher, just to demonstrate you've complied with the checklist, you followed it. And this is an example of a PRISMA flow diagram that is typically included as a figure in a published article. Again, there's a 2020 version, but it's very similar, except that it allows for more different types of sources, like saying, did you do citation analysis? Did you search clinical trial registries? And then the thing that jumped out at me is that it also asks you to note if you used artificial intelligence tools in the screening process. So again, just kind of this growing interest in seeing if AI can help prioritize the reviewing process at all, to reduce the amount of time involved in screening. And I've only just started reading about this and what biases that can introduce anyway. So that's probably a lecture that someone else can give at some time. And so you thought I was done with documentation, but there is another new reporting form. This one is not an update, it's a brand new one, and it's focused on search reporting. So this is considered an extension to the main PRISMA checklist and flow diagram. And the focus here is just transparency and reproducibility in the search method reporting. And one of the requirements is to include the search strategies for each database copied and pasted, so someone else could copy and paste it into the same database on the same platform, run it, and get the same results you did, except maybe more current. So that's a new thing. And the strategies, depending on where you're submitting it, might be supplementary materials, or they might get deposited in the repository. It's new enough that I don't yet know what the standard is going to be. So after an hour talking about systematic review methodology and real world experience, what do you think? Does the outcome seem worth the work? It may turn out that a systematic review is not the best project for you, but there is a lot of value in doing a systematic review and doing it well, because systematic reviews help the community know what's effective, how to spend limited resources, what additional research is needed. They're also really valuable for helping students and researchers and practitioners stay current with the literature. You've taken on the giant task of synthesizing what's known, and then many people can benefit from that. And many people are likely to cite your article. And that's so if you're interested in boosting your H-index a little bit, you can also, the systematic reviews might help you with that. So this at the end, as Angela said, we're going to send out the slides, but these are references addressing some of the places to look for guidance, different review types, all those new Prisma protocols, and then the software tools. So now we wanted to give time for any questions you had or anything you might want to see, and you can unmute, or I'll let Mira.
No, you're fine. So I guess we'll give people maybe a couple of minutes to type your question into the chat if you would like to. You could make it public or direct message it to me and I can read it out. Or you're also welcome to unmute. And we do have one question so far if that we could maybe get started with while people brainstorm their questions and type it into the chat. So Leslie asked and I'm not sure if any of us have, but for those who have familiarity with both RAIAN and covidence, what are the key differences or how do they compare?
So I have small amounts of experience with both, and that is part of the reason why I included in the references. There is an article that specifically compares RAIAN and covidence. So my understanding, so RAIAN is free, and it is designed most for the screening process. So importing the references, going through the title abstract screening and doing those votes on to the next stage of full text review. Whereas covidence supports more parts of the systematic review process. But I'm not keeping up with my email, and I know that RAIAN wrote me within the last couple of weeks to tell me what new things they were offering. So these are always changing. I'm not sure if that's a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, Anjuli also put a reference in the chat, which it looks like an article comparing both. Neil, I was asking, I've heard the term narrative review thrown around recently. Any insight into what this type of review is and any benefits or disadvantages?
This is another example of where if someone in the audience has experience, that's great. I just look at that chart that I put in the references where it has 14 review types, where it talks about what the differences might be or when they might be appropriate, but I'm afraid I don't have personal experience. Maybe someone else does.
Someone asked about the supportive literature column in the last slide that I showed, which I could mention briefly. I don't know that that's always done in qualitative reviews, but we were working off of a couple of templates that we saw keep track of supportive literature for findings. And I think our intention for that was mainly just to be transparent about where findings came from, and then also for the reader to be able to know which studies they could look to if they were interested in a particular finding to learn more about kind of like participant experiences associated with that theme. So we did not have the intention of like keeping track of like strength of findings based on how many studies reported something or anything like that. It was more of the intention of just we kept track of which studies reported each theme. And so we thought that that would be helpful information for the reader to be able to just see, first of all, that a theme was reported across samples, and then to be able to know where to look if they would like to read more into that. And then someone asked, do we need to change our search terms depending on the database we use once we have developed a search strategy? Good question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So typically, we develop a search strategy in one database to get the scope right. So you're doing all of that iterative, trying something, reviewing, trying something, reviewing. And so then once you get it set in one database, then you want to do comparable searches in other databases But as you suggested, databases aren't necessarily structured the same way. They don't necessarily use the same syntax. And a lot of databases will have a thesaurus or a set of subject headings that are specific for the content in that database. So PsycInfo will have terms that are relevant for psychology, behavior. PubMed will have subject headings that are relevant for broader aspects of health sciences. And so there is some translating that goes on where you're trying to reproduce as well as possible to do a comparable search in another database, but it's not exact, but it is helpful if you use one set of subject headings in one database. When you go to a new database, try to see what terms are used there. That's the sort of thing librarians are happy to help you with.
And then the next question is related. What is the recommended number of databases we should search for a systematic review?
Well, Mira, how many did you decide on? And Anjuli, how many did you decide on?
Ours was 5, and you could see that we pulled 5,000 references, or I guess we pulled a total of 8,000 references, of which 3,000 were duplicates. And so I'm not sure. I imagine if we continued to add databases, I guess we could have experimented to see how many additional duplicates we'd find, but that was the number we did.
I think that's how many we did, maybe a few more, but I think that like the selection of which databases to include is different depending on which review, your review questions. I also wanted to mention that searching conference abstracts is also something that you might do, and the search capabilities for conferences are typically much more limited, much more limited. And so when we searched for CROI, the Conference on Retroviruses and Opportunistic Infections, and AIDS, or IAS, which is another HIV one, and we actually had to change our search strategy fully. Like you couldn't do anything within these databases. And what we ended up doing was taking the PDF of the abstract book from each of those relevant years. And because we were actually looking only at randomized trials, we looked for randomi, and then didn't put in the Z or the S because of the differential spelling, and then looked at everything that came up with randomi to rule out random sampling, but bring in randomized trials. And that was actually what we used for that. So you might actually have a slightly different search strategy. And it's important to document what you did exactly if you're using different sources. And it may differ based on the database capabilities for the sources you're looking at.
And that's the randomized control trials. That's a good example. So like a lot of people, if they're doing a systematic review where they are looking for randomized controlled trials, they'll search PubMed or Medline, Embase, and then the Cochrane Central, the trials database. And so you use slightly different terms because PubMed and Embase use different subject headings. And then when you get to Cochrane, you don't have to add the randomized control part because that's the part that's already been selected for. So.
Awesome. And then someone asked, have any of the presenters done a systematic review without a team available, for example, as part of a PhD? So I'm doing it as part of a PhD, but I do have a team. I would say that there are some parts of a systematic review that, like, it's pretty standard to have 2 reviewers for many of the steps, including screening, data extraction, quality appraisal. I'm not sure if it's ever done with a single person, but I would probably have some hesitancy about that, especially as a student. So I think it is a really great project to collaborate on. That doesn't mean you have to have a huge team. I think you could do it with a small team of a couple of people. It could be like other students in your program who are interested in the topic, or recruiting undergrads like I discussed a little bit, or faculty mentors. And I think it's a great project to, others often have an interest in being involved in systematic reviews, even if the specific topic area isn't perfectly in line with their research interest, just because it's such useful methodology and skills to develop. And I think like the process of being able to appraise the quality of articles and read quickly for essential information are just such valuable skills that I think a lot of people would maybe be interested in helping you out, even if it's not exactly in line with their research interests. So that would be my perspective. I don't know if Anjuli and Diana have anything to add.
I echo everything you said, Mira. The one kind of practical tip I've worked on, I realize now it's 5 systematic reviews, and I would keep in mind how much bandwidth the people on your team have time-wise, and how that is like, 5% over 12 months is very different than, a full month of time in terms of how long it takes to do a review. And I say this because your review can get out of date very quickly, and it will impact your ability to publish it. And what I hope none of you will ever have to do is repeat your search and update your review. So if you can work with people who have more bandwidth for a shorter duration of time, I highly recommend that. So asking an overextended peer who also needs a buddy to do it alongside you, and have that review take 2 or 3 years during your PhD, it can create more work for you along the way. So I highly recommend working with folks who do have bandwidth to execute something in a shorter calendar time period so that you can maximize your chances of publishing that review.
I think those were all the questions in the chat, other than asking about the slides being shared, which will be shared. I guess we could wait another minute, see if anyone else wants to type a question in, or you're also welcome to unmute yourself.
I have a question about the registration. So yeah, I think you introduced the advantage of that, in regard to, just avoid any duplication or stuff. But I also see some people, get registered and they didn't publish and, put that there for like 4 or 5 years. And I'm like, and maybe this is, a similar topic that I'm interested in as well. So, I'm like, should I reach out to them? Should I just do my own thing? And I also heard the argument from some like faculty or senior researcher. They said they prefer not to register because it is possible that the team or the project may just, close at some point and they don't want to delay other people's interests. So I think there's a debate here, and I just wonder, what about your thought on this?
Yeah, I just echo what part of what Anjuli put in the chat is that's an excellent point. And, there are plenty of examples of things that have been registered and no evidence that there's work being done, no publication. And so I'll just let Anjuli, maybe you could say that point for everyone about the journal expectations.
Yeah, I think increasingly, particularly high impact factor journals are expecting that you will have registered your review prior to commencing work, and they won't accept reviews that haven't had the registration. So I hear you, Chenglin. I think you have a great point here, especially with the possibility of scooping and stuff. I will say, I think the probability of someone scooping your idea for a systematic review is much more slim than in other areas and fields. I would be thrilled to hear when other people have had experiences, but I've seen from journals, I would err on the side of publishing, of registering your review in order to maximize the potential impact that you can have later when you go to a journal.
Yeah, thank you.
Neil also asked, relevant to the publication process, any recommended journals that specialize in reviews or advice in how to ask if a journal is receptive to publishing a review? And I would imagine this probably depends on your topic area as opposed to what the most appropriate journals would be. I will say one thing I've done in the past, that can be helpful. If you do have a target journal or an idea of a couple of journals you'd be interested in publishing in, it's really helpful to do a search of any systematic reviews of the type you're conducting. So if it's quantitative or qualitative, that they've published in the last couple of years, because that, as you kind of could see from Diana's presentation, there's a lot of decision points where there's different ways you can appraise quality, there's different ways you can present findings, there's different ways you can document your process. So if they have published reviews, it's really helpful to choose a couple that you like and use kind of them as potential templates when you're designing your manuscript, and also figuring out potentially the tools to use throughout your process so that you can kind of set yourself up to be in line with their expectations and kind of what they've accepted in the past. That's one idea I have.
I could piggyback on that and say, you know, good question, Neil. My experience has been that the process for identifying journals for primary research articles and review articles is the same. And I actually haven't seen too many differences or departures. There's some journals that don't publish systematic reviews, so you know, knock those off your list. But generally, think about like, who do you want to use this data? Who do you want to influence with this? What's the readership you're aiming to target? Then find like a journal that has that readership, accepts systematic reviews. The one that is slightly off topic is the place where I found it hardest and where it departs from primary research is conferences. I have found that conferences are less receptive to systematic reviews as abstracts and posters in some of the ones I've applied to. So that's one area where you just might hit like a strange snafu along the way. But for publication in journals, I've seen it's somewhat of a similar process. And Leslie points out Jane. Jane is a fabulous resource.
Yeah, if you look in the chat, Jane is a good tool for finding journals that have published similar research. You can put your proposed title or abstract in there. And then when you follow up and look at some of those journals, some of the journals and their instructions to authors will lay out what they're looking for in systematic reviews, you know, as a research type. Yeah, thanks for including that.
Are there any other last questions? Awesome. Well, thank you. I guess I'll pass it back to Angela.
Excuse me. Thanks, Mira. And thank you so much, Diana, Anjuli, and Mira, for this presentation. It was very informative, very wonderful. And thanks all for attending and for all of your questions. Please look out for the evaluation survey that I'll be sending via email after this. And also send out the slides to all who were asking about that. And if you enjoyed this event, please consider signing up to be a BIRCH member or joining our BIRCH mailing list. I'll include information about that in the email as well. So thanks again and have a good weekend.